My father once laughed at me in a room full of veterans and said, "She's just a girl playing soldier." The men around him chuckled politely. The beer bottles clinked. Someone coughed to break the awkward silence. And I stood there in full dress uniform, medals aligned perfectly over my heart, feeling smaller than I had at 18 years old on the first day of basic training. I am Sergeant Lauren Mitchell. I've trained special operations candidates in urban combat strategy. I've prepped 3 deployment cycles. I've written field manuals still used in advanced Overwatch simulations. But none of that mattered in that moment. Because the only person I ever really wanted to impress was my father. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been dismissed by someone whose approval meant everything to you, stay with me. Because what unfolded that night changed my life in ways I never saw coming. Growing up, my father's identity was built around his Gulf War service. He wasn't a decorated war hero. He ran convoy security and logistics operations. Important work, absolutely. But he told those stories like they were scenes from a blockbuster film. I grew up on those stories. I memorized them. I watched the way his shoulders squared when he described desert nights under threat. I watched how men leaned in when he spoke. That was the moment I decided I would wear a uniform one day. Not for glory. Not for medals. For him. When I enlisted at 17, he smiled, but it wasn't pride. It was skepticism disguised as encouragement. "The Army's different now," he said. "It's not the same grit we had." I told myself he just needed time. I trained harder than everyone else in my platoon. I shot higher qualification scores. I volunteered for extra drills. When I earned my first leadership stripe, I called him immediately. He said, "That's nice, honey. Just don't forget it's mostly politics these days." That pattern continued for years. Every promotion was minimized. Every accomplishment reframed. When I qualified for Advanced Urban Warfare Instructor certification, he asked if they'd lowered standards to boost diversity. When I was selected to help train Rangers before deployment, he said, "Training isn't combat." I learned to swallow the disappointment. I told myself he didn't understand the modern military. I told myself one day I'd do something so undeniable that he'd have to see me. Then came the classified deployment cycle. It wasn't public. It wasn't televised. It wasn't even officially acknowledged for years. I can't give every detail, but here's what I can say. A battalion was pinned down during an extraction operation in a densely packed urban district overseas. Intelligence had been wrong. Resistance was coordinated. Escape routes were compromised. I was positioned on elevated overwatch as part of a rapid support contingency. What was supposed to be a 6-hour support rotation turned into 40 hours of sustained engagement. I managed air support coordination, relayed ground repositioning, and engaged hostile forces closing in on trapped American troops. When it ended, 53 U.S. soldiers walked out alive. 31 confirmed hostile eliminations were logged under my scope. I was extracted unconscious from dehydration and shrapnel wounds. The entire operation was buried in classified archives due to political sensitivities. My commendation read like administrative support. I never corrected anyone. Especially not my father. The humiliation that night at the Veterans Hall didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for years. That hall was packed. Men from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Retired officers in faded unit caps. My father was holding court, beer in hand, introducing his old friend Daniel Reeves, a retired Navy SEAL he'd known decades ago. Daniel carried himself quietly. He wasn't loud. He didn't brag. That alone told me everything. But my father was glowing beside him, like he was basking in reflected heroism. I stood near the bar when someone asked about my career. Before I could answer, my father laughed. Lauren? She trains. She's never seen real combat. It's cute though. She tries. The room shifted. That kind of statement lands heavy among veterans. You don't diminish service lightly in a room like that. I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I didn't speak. Then he delivered the line that cut deeper than anything else. She's just playing soldier. Not like Daniel here. Now that's the real deal. That's when everything stopped. Daniel's expression changed instantly. He looked at me longer. Studied my posture. My ribbons. My face. And then he went pale. Mitchell, he asked quietly. I didn't respond. My father laughed awkwardly. Yeah, that's her. Why? Daniel didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on me. Rooftop overwatch. Market sector. 40-hour hold. The room went silent. You could hear ice settle in glasses. I felt my pulse in my throat. You're the one they pulled out half dead after coordinating the second extraction corridor. My father blinked. What are you talking about? Daniel finally turned to him. I'm talking about the soldier who kept an entire battalion from being wiped out. And just like that, the narrative shattered. The rest of that night unfolded in a blur. Veterans who had been skeptical minutes earlier stepped forward with a new kind of respect. Questions shifted from condescending curiosity to professional inquiry. Daniel explained enough without breaching classification to make the point clear. I hadn't just trained soldiers. I had saved them. My father stood frozen. The room that had once been his stage was no longer responding to him. It was responding to me. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something heavier. Not victory. Not vindication. Just the collapse of an illusion I had carried since childhood. That was the night I realized something devastating. I had built my entire career trying to earn the approval of a man who was never going to give it. And the worst part wasn't that he didn't know what I had done. It was that he had never cared enough to ask. What happened after that confrontation didn't fix anything. It made things worse. Because when respect finally came, it didn't come from him. It came from everyone else. And that was only the beginning. The morning after the Veterans Hall dinner, my phone would not stop vibrating. At first I assumed it was routine-based chatter, scheduling updates, training adjustments. It wasn't. It was veterans. Men I had never met personally.
Retired officers. Former infantry. A couple of Marines who said they had friends in the battalion from that operation. Word travels fast in military circles, especially when it involves something classified that suddenly isn't so invisible anymore. Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. Sergeant Mitchell, we heard about what you did. My son was in that sector. He came home. Every call was respectful. Every voice steady. And every one of them felt like a quiet contrast to the only voice I had spent 20 years wanting to hear. At the base, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Soldiers who had always respected my rank now respected something else. They asked sharper questions during urban overwatch simulations. They listened longer during debriefs. There's a difference between following someone because of stripes on their sleeve and following someone because they've been tested under real fire. That difference settled into the room every time I stepped in front of a whiteboard. Captain Ellis pulled me aside one afternoon after a training block. You know you don't owe anyone an explanation, right? He said. Especially not family. I nodded. But it wasn't about explanation anymore. It was about the realization that I had been shrinking myself to protect someone else's ego. 3 weeks later, my cousin's engagement party forced the next collision. I considered not going. The thought of standing in another crowded room with my father pretending nothing had happened made my chest tight. But avoiding him felt like surrender. So I showed up in a simple navy dress, no uniform this time, no visible reminders of rank or medals. I wasn't there as Sergeant Mitchell. I was there as Lauren. The atmosphere shifted the moment I walked in. Conversations paused for a second too long. My father was near the kitchen island, drink already in hand. He spotted me. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Lauren," he said, like he was testing the sound of my name. "Good to see you." We both knew we were standing on broken ground. Relatives who had barely asked about my career before suddenly had questions. Real questions. What exactly do you teach? Is it true you coordinate air support? How do you stay focused that long? The respect felt genuine, but it also carried something bittersweet. These were the same people who had listened politely while my father redirected conversations for years. Now the redirection wasn't working. When he tried to pivot into his convoy security stories, people listened briefly, then turned back to me. The center of gravity in the room had shifted. He felt it. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. Later that night, he cornered me on the back patio. The string lights above us flickered in the wind. "You let him embarrass me," he said quietly. I stared at him, genuinely stunned. "You embarrassed yourself," I replied. He shook his head. "You could have told me about that mission." There it was. Not an apology. Not remorse. Just a complaint that he had been left out of something important. "It was classified," I said evenly. "And you never once asked what I actually did. You assumed." He exhaled sharply. "I was protecting you." "From what?" I asked. "From the reality of who I am." The silence between us stretched. He had spent years protecting his image of me, not me. In the weeks that followed, something inside me shifted permanently. I stopped filtering my accomplishments in conversations. When someone asked about my work, I answered directly. Not arrogantly. Not dramatically. Just factually. I had held a position under sustained engagement. I had coordinated extraction corridors. I had trained operators who later deployed successfully. I no longer softened it to make it more comfortable for him. And the more I stopped shrinking, the more I realized how small I had been allowed to feel for so long. Then came the reunion invitation. 2nd Battalion was organizing a private gathering for veterans of that operation. Daniel had passed along my contact information. I stared at the email for 2 days before responding. Part of me wanted to keep that chapter sealed. But another part needed closure. I flew out quietly, no media, no announcements. Just me walking into a modest hotel conference room filled with men who had been trapped in that market district years ago. They stood when I entered. Not out of ceremony. Out of memory. Sergeant Alvarez was the first to reach me. He had a scar along his jaw I didn't remember. "I thought you were a myth," he said, laughing softly. The voice on the roof. Others nodded. They remembered the cadence of my radio calls. The calm tone. The precise updates. "You never sounded afraid," one of them told me. I didn't tell them that I had been terrified. That fear just didn't get transmitted through a headset. We spent hours recounting details I hadn't spoken aloud in 2 decades. Not the kill count. Not the violence. The coordination. The discipline. The teamwork. They remembered the moment the extraction corridor opened because hostile fire had suddenly shifted. They remembered hearing that the Overwatch position was still active when it should have been abandoned. They remembered walking out alive. During dinner, Daniel raised a glass. To the one who refused to leave, he said. There was no applause this time. Just a steady murmur of agreement. It wasn't loud recognition. It was earned acknowledgement. And in that room, I felt something I had never felt at any family gathering. I felt understood. After the reunion, the calls escalated. Not from veterans this time. From command channels. A senior operations advisor wanted to review the tactical logs. A defense training consultant wanted to integrate the Overwatch model into updated urban warfare doctrine. There was talk of partial declassification for instructional purposes. It wasn't about fame. It was about lessons learned. I agreed to participate. If those 40 hours could sharpen someone else's readiness, then it mattered. When my father read the first article summarizing the declassified portions of the mission, he didn't call immediately. He waited. 2 weeks later, he showed up unannounced at my apartment. He looked older. Smaller. He held a folded newspaper in his hand. I didn't know, he said before I even invited him in. I studied his face. For the first time, there was no defensiveness. Just something fragile. I didn't know, he repeated. I stepped aside and let him enter.
He sat at my kitchen table, staring at the headline. They said you held it alone. I wasn't alone, I replied. I had a battalion on the ground depending on me. He swallowed hard. I spent years thinking combat meant what I experienced. Convoys. Roadside threats. Clear lines. He looked up at me. I didn't understand what it became. I didn't understand what you became. That was the closest thing to humility I had ever heard from him. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't tears. It was acknowledgement. And strangely, that was enough. But here's the truth. By the time he said he was proud of me, I no longer needed it. I had already rebuilt my identity without him. The girl who enlisted to win her father's approval had evolved into a soldier who understood her own value. Recognition had come from battalion commanders. From special operations advisors. From young recruits who saw proof that discipline has no gender. My father's approval was no longer oxygen. It was just air. Yet one final moment remained. One final gathering at the same veterans' hall where it had all fractured. And that night would prove whether respect, once lost, can ever truly be reclaimed. I didn't plan on going back to the veterans' hall. The building hadn't changed. Same faded flags on the walls. Same heavy wooden bar. Same hum of old stories floating above clinking glasses. But I had changed. And that difference mattered more than I realized. It had been almost a year since the night my father laughed and called me a girl playing soldier. In that time, parts of my service record had been declassified for instructional use. My Fallujah Overwatch operation had become a case study in adaptive urban warfare. I had consulted with special operations instructors. I had briefed officers on rooftop positioning strategy and multi-channel coordination under sustained engagement. The story that once lived in silence was now being used to sharpen the readiness of soldiers heading into unpredictable terrain. And still, walking through those hall doors made my chest tighten. This time, I wasn't in full dress uniform. I wore a simple dark blazer and my service pin. No spectacle. No performance. Just presence. The difference in the room was immediate. Younger veterans approached me first. A lieutenant deploying overseas next spring wanted clarification on sightline prioritization in dense civilian sectors. A former ranger asked about managing hydration during prolonged overwatch when extraction windows collapse. The conversations were technical, focused, professional. There was no ego in them. Just soldiers trying to get better at something that demands everything. Across the room, my father stood near the bar. He wasn't holding court anymore. The crowd around him was thinner than it used to be. Daniel stood nearby, but not as close as before. Their easy camaraderie had cooled after that first public confrontation. Respect in military circles is built on integrity. Once it cracks, it doesn't repair cleanly. At one point, Master Sergeant Hall called out from a nearby table. "Mitchell, tell them about corridor recalibration under hostile shift." The room turned toward me. A year ago, that would have been my father's spotlight. Now it was simply a question directed at the person qualified to answer it. So I did. I explained how hostile clusters adapt to visible extraction routes. How maintaining unpredictability matters more than raw firepower. How calm radio cadence stabilizes ground units even when nothing about the situation is stable. I spoke evenly. No dramatics. No embellishment. When I finished, there was no applause. Just nods. The kind professionals give each other when something valuable has been shared. My father approached me later in the evening. For a moment, I thought he might default back into deflection. Instead, he surprised me. "I listened," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. He glanced around the room. "They respect you." "Yes." He hesitated. "I should have from the beginning." There it was. No performance. No audience. No defensiveness. Just truth. "I spent years thinking respect was something you held on to," he continued. "Like a rank you don't want anyone outranking. I didn't realize it grows. It doesn't shrink when someone else earns it." For the first time in my life, he wasn't competing with me. He was acknowledging me. "I can't undo what I said," he added. "But I see you now." And strangely, that was enough. Not because it healed everything. Not because it erased 20 years of dismissal. But because I no longer needed him to say it. I had already stepped into who I was. As the evening wound down, Daniel walked over. "You handled that better than most would," he said quietly. "It stopped being about him a long time ago," I answered. That was the real turning point. The moment I understood that my father's opinion had once shaped my identity, but it no longer defined it. I had built something independent of him. Something tested under pressure. Something validated by professionals who understood sacrifice, coordination, and responsibility. 3 months later, I stood at Fort Liberty delivering a lecture to advanced tactical instructors. Behind me, slides displayed Overwatch schematics drawn from my operation. In front of me, soldiers listened not because of my last name, but because of what I had done. After the session, a young female recruit approached me. She looked nervous but determined. "Ma'am," she said, "my grandfather keeps telling me the army isn't built for women. That real combat is different." I held her gaze. "Real combat doesn't care who you are," I said. "It cares whether you're disciplined. Whether you're prepared. Whether you stay when others can't. That's it." She nodded slowly. I saw something shift in her posture. Confidence doesn't always explode. Sometimes it settles quietly into someone's spine.
That night, I drove home alone. The city lights blurred slightly through the windshield. I thought about the 17-year-old version of me who enlisted just to make her father proud. She had no idea what she would endure. No idea she would one day hold a rooftop for nearly 2 days straight while coordinating survival for dozens of men. No idea she would learn that validation from family can be powerful, but validation from within is permanent. My father and I never became what we used to be. Some distances remain. But there is peace where tension once lived. He no longer dismisses my work. He listens when I speak. And that's more than I once thought possible. If you're watching this and you've ever been dismissed by someone you love, I want you to hear this clearly. Their inability to recognize your strength does not reduce it. Their insecurity does not invalidate your discipline. And sometimes, the approval you chase for years is the very thing you outgrow. Have you ever been underestimated in front of others? Did you speak up, or did you let your results speak later? Drop your story in the comments. I read them. And if this resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that respect is earned through action, not handed out through opinion. Because the moment you stop shrinking for someone else is the moment you finally stand at your full height. This is Sergeant Lauren Mitchell. And I don't play soldier.